Hi, this is Mrs. Poland, and I'd like to review the concepts of type 1 and type 2 errors. A type 1 error is when you reject the null when the null is true. A type 2 error is when you fail to reject the null when the null is actually false. And a good way to remember it is with a type 2 error, there's like a double F. You're failing to reject the null and your null is false. So when you hear the double F, think type 2. The best way to understand a type 1 and type 2 error is by example. The USDA limit for salmonella contamination for chicken is 20%. A meat inspector reports that the chicken produced by a company exceeds the USDA limit. You perform a hypothesis test to determine whether the meat inspector's claim is true. What are the null and alternative hypotheses? Describe your type 1 error in context, describe your type 2 error in context, and describe the consequences and which error is more serious. So for the null hypothesis, we would say that proportion P is equal to 0.2, and that the the alternative hypothesis is that P is greater than 0.2. And P equals 0.2 means that the chicken is at USDA limit. P is greater than 0.2 means that the chicken is above the USDA limit. A type 1 error is when you're failing to reject the null hypothesis, when in fact the null hypothesis is true. So in this case, that means you're concluding that the chicken is contaminated when it's actually fine. With a type 2 error, you're failing to reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is false. So what that means in this context is you're concluding that the chicken is not contaminated when it actually is infected with salmonella. What is the consequence of a type 1 error? The consequence is that you're going to throw it out and there's going to be financial loss. The consequence with a type 2 error is you're not going to throw it out. It's going to be sold and eaten, and people will become ill. Which is worse? Hopefully, from both an ethical standpoint, you would consider people becoming ill worse. A good way to represent type 1 and type 2 error is with a chart. And if you notice that the rows of the column headings of this chart represent the truth about the null, so either the null is true or the null is false, and the row headings are based on the conclusion you're going to have. You're either going to reject the null or fail to reject the null. So if you reject the null and the null is true, that is a type 1 error. And the probability of having a type 1 error is based upon your rejection region, and you reject based on alpha. If your null is false and you reject it, well, that's what you want, and that's a good decision. If your null hypothesis is true and you fail to reject it, well, that's also a good decision. But if your null hypothesis is false and you fail to reject, well, that's what we're, again, considering a type 2 error. The probability of a type 2 error, we call beta. And beta is a little bit more complicated to calculate, and you're not actually responsible for it for the AP exam, except in its relation to power. Well, what is power of a test? the power of the test is correctly rejecting the null hypothesis. So that would be this case here. This would be considered the power of the test. And there's a relationship between power, a direct relationship between power and a type 2 error. So power is actually equal to 1 minus the probability of making a type 2 error. We're going to go more into power on Monday's lesson.